My name is Clive Norris, and my talk is entitled John Wesley and the East India Company, a case of my enemy's enemy is my friend. I'll just share my screen. The East India Company was one of the biggest players in the 18th century British economy and in British politics. But from the mid-1760s, it attracted sustained public criticism following its conquest of Bengal, standing accused of systematic and brutal racist exploitation abroad, while its officials were attacked for extravagant living and corruption back home. John Wesley, however, long remained silent on these matters, and in this paper, I explore why this was. The East India Company received its founding charter from Elizabeth I in 1600. Its ships brought huge volumes of tea, its largest business, silk, porcelain, spices, and other luxury goods to Britain. Unlike the Virginia Company, established in 1606, it was conceived as a trading and not a colonizing venture. However, in the mid-18th century, its character suddenly and dramatically changed. It acquired an empire in Bengal and 2 other Indian provinces, extending over a land area as large as France and Spain, and governing a population twice that of the British Isles. Wealth from India flooded into Britain. The 1765 deal between Robert Clive and the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II alone generated £4 million in net revenues for the company in 6 years, perhaps £500 million today. The word loot entered our language from Hindi, recorded in a dictionary published by a company army captain in 1773. In 1767, the government stepped in amidst widespread concern about the speculative bubble which the company's gains had generated. Many also thought that the state should benefit financially, not least because its armed forces had supported the company's Indian ventures. One act restricted the scope for stock splitting, a new and unethical practice whereby speculators swayed company decisions by dividing their stock holdings temporarily into parcels of £500 worth of shares, the minimum qualification to vote in the company's oversight body, the General Court of Stockholders. Stock now had to be held for 6 months before attracting voting rights. The second act capped annual dividends at 10%. The company also agreed to pay the government £400,000, some £50 million today, each year. Shortly afterwards, disaster struck. The 1768 monsoon was unusually light, leading to drought and famine the following year. An estimated 1.2 million people, 1 in 5 Bengalis, perished during the famine's peak in 1770. While the local Indian authorities did their best to relieve the distress, the response of company officials was grossly inadequate. They continued to focus on revenue raising rather than famine relief, imposing capital punishment on those resisting taxes. In 1772, a banking crisis hit Europe, following the disappearance of the indebted Scottish banker Alexander Fordyce, and this engulfed the East India Company. In response, the government tightened the restrictions on stock splitting. The minimum holding with voting rights increased to £1,000, and the minimum period for which the stock had to be held before voting doubled to 12 months. All these events were widely publicised. A 1767 pamphlet claimed that, I quote, "the business between the East India Company and the state is become the principal object of the nation's attention," end quote. The General Court played a key role in the nation's political life. By June 1771, 120 MPs and many peers were members. There were four main areas of public and political concern. First, there was widespread disgust at the wealth which returning officials, the nabobs, had extracted from India, and at their conspicuous consumption, such as the construction of splendid houses. The recent National Trust report on colonialism suggests that at least 229 landed estates were bought in Britain between 1700 and 1850 with company money. And this shows the great Robert Clive himself and his splendid house at Claremont in Surrey. Second, nabobs were accused of buying political influence, as Clive had done. The Earl of Chatham told Parliament in 1770, "The riches of Asia have been poured in upon us and have brought with them not only Asiatic luxury, but, I fear, Asiatic principles of government. Without connections, without any natural interest in the soil, the importers of foreign gold have forced their way into Parliament by such a torrent of private corruption as no private hereditary fortune could resist." Third, commentators criticised the inappropriateness of a private company running an empire, and there were calls for its monopoly to be broken up. As Arthur Young wrote in 1772, I quote, "Trade and the sword ought not to be managed by the same people. Barter and exchange is a business of merchants, not fighting of battles and dethroning of princes," end quote. Fourth, from 1770, the chorus of attacks on the company for its rapacious and ineffective governance of India grew as reports on the Bengal famine reached Britain. Thus, in April 1772, the Chester Courant newspaper published extracts from a letter from an officer of reputation in Bengal, who reported from the city of Patna, the provincial capital of Bihar. I quote, "Upon entering it, I saw nothing for the space of 2 miles, but ruinous and deserted houses, putrid bodies of dead men scattered on every side, miserable, emaciated creatures in the shape of men crawling along the streets with famished and eager looks that would have frightened you," end quote. Horace Walpole pithily summarised the company's destructive impact on both India and Britain as conquest, usurpation, wealth, luxury, famine. John Wesley had expressed his disapproval of aspects of imperialism in his 1750 sermon, number 38, A Caution Against Bigotry, in which he accused all the imperial powers of cruelty to conquered peoples. But he said nothing about the East India Company's exploitation of India until 1776, a decade after its conquest of Bengal, and made extensive comments only some years later. Wesley's public silence is surprising because there were many features of the company's operations which he must have abhorred. Its cruelty in Bengal was widely reported. Thus, some execrable oppressions, including the torture of prisoners, were detailed in Jackson's Oxford Journal in 1772. So was its massive misappropriation of wealth from India. For Wesley, of course, God has committed to our charge that precious talent which contains all the rest, money. It was to be managed with care and used to further God's purposes. The company's trade in luxury goods also sat uneasily with his focus on necessaries, and tea was a drink about which he had serious concerns, believing it to be both prejudicial to health and unduly expensive. And of course, the company trafficked enslaved people between possessions such as St. Helena. Wesley's silence looks especially odd since he published a series of pamphlets on public affairs in the 1770s. By the mid-1770s, Wesley was showing growing interest in developments in India. He read a sympathetic analysis of Hindu scriptures by a retired East India Company official, John Zephaniah Holwell, and ridiculed it in a letter of the 28th of November 1774 to the Lloyd's Evening Post. And Wesley also studied a powerful attack on the company by another former official, William Bolts, his 1772 Considerations on Indian Affairs. Bolts offered a comprehensive and highly influential critique of the company's activities and impact. The dominions in Asia have been abandoned as lawful prey to every species of peculators, insomuch that many of the servants of the company, after exhibiting such scenes of barbarity as can scarcely be paralleled in the history of any country, have returned to England loaded with wealth, where, entrenching themselves in borough or East India stock influence, they have set justice at defiance. In his journal for the 23rd of February 1776, Wesley reported, I quote, "I looked over Mr. Bolt's Considerations on the Affairs of India. Was there ever so melancholy a picture? We may call the myriads that have been murdered happy in comparison of those that still groan under the iron yoke," end quote. And on the 13th of November 1776, he returned to the issue, condemning the merciless cruelty with which the English have plundered the desolated provinces of Hindustan. While these parts of Wesley's journal were not published until 1783, in 1776, Wesley finally went public on India. In his seasonable address on the American Rebellion, he also condemned the East India Company for the refined iniquity practiced there of fomenting war amongst the natives and seizing the chief of the plunder. What millions have fallen by these means, as well as by artificial famine. O earth, cover not thou their blood. It will speak to heaven and to the inhabitants of the earth, to the latest posterity. Thereafter, Wesley seems to have made no further public comments on East India Company affairs for several years. In 1783 and 84, however, he published a series of highly critical statements on company rule in India. Apart from the journal extracts cited above, in the 1783 sermon, number 61, The Mystery of Iniquity, he lamented the corrupt, infernal, devilish behaviour of the English in India. And in the 1784 sermon, number 69, The Imperfection of Human Knowledge, Wesley observed, I quote, "In what condition in particular is the large and populous empire of Indostan? How many hundred thousands of the poor quiet people have been destroyed and their carcasses left in the dung of the earth?" These sermons were published in the Arminian magazine in 1783 and 1784, respectively, but were reflecting on events dating from the mid-1760s. Why the long silence? One possible explanation is that the Wesley Circle had a long and complicated history of involvement with the East India Company. In the early 1700s, John's father Samuel sent a paper proposing a mission to the East Indies to the Archbishop of York, John Sharp, to be based at Surat on the Indian west coast, where his brother-in-law Samuel Annesley was a merchant. Wesley hoped for financial support from the East India Company, and perhaps from the Crown too, as a means of reducing French influence. However, nothing came of it. Annesley, John Wesley's uncle, joined the company in 1677, aged 19, and went to Surat. He initially prospered, but his career was troubled when he was accused of malpractice and dismissed in 1698. He then became an independent free trader. He died childless and near destitution in 1732. But according to Adam Clarke, I quote, "Mr. John Wesley used to say to his nephews, 'You are heirs to a large property in India, if you could find it out, for my uncle is said to have been very prosperous,'" end quote. Clarke suggested that John and Charles Wesley's elder brother Samuel also has some dealings with the East India Company, and he claimed that in the 1730s, John Wesley himself entertained thoughts of undertaking a mission to India. In 1783 and 4, the leading Methodist preacher Thomas Coke circulated plans for a connectional missionary effort to India and elsewhere. But in February 1784, Wesley recorded in his journal that such an endeavour had been ruled impracticable. I quote, "Saturday the 14th, I desired all our preachers to meet and consider thoroughly the proposal of sending missionaries to the East Indies. After the matter had been fully considered, we were unanimous in our judgment that we have no call thither yet, no invitation, no providential opening of any kind." So it is possible that John Wesley, at least for a period, contemplated some Methodist mission to India. He may have hoped that his uncle Samuel Annesley's mythical riches would subsidize this. In any event, such a venture would have been impossible without the East India Company's support. This may have dissuaded Wesley from public criticism of the company, at least until 1784. Another factor was Wesley's friendship and financial relationship with Ebenezer Blackwell, a partner in the Martins banking concern. And this shows his tomb in Lewisham churchyard. Blackwell was intimately involved in East India Company affairs on multiple levels, and some of the funds that flowed to Wesley from Blackwell possibly derived from his commercial ventures in India. Public condemnation of the company would have risked accusations of hypocrisy. More positively, however, this relationship led Wesley to believe that he could influence the company through Blackwell from the inside. At one point, Wesley addressed this letter to certain proprietors of East India stock. I shan't read it in full, but as you can see, it reminds them that they took an oath that the shares that they voted belonged to them. And he argued that by using the stock splitting technique, they were actually behaving unethically because they didn't own the stock in the name of which they were voting. According to the leading Methodist layman William Marriott, who published the text in 1848, Wesley sent this letter for Blackwell to use in the run-up to one of the annual elections for directors. It raises four intriguing questions. When precisely was it written? What was it saying? What was its purpose? And what was its effect? The date of the letter is uncertain. The reference to a £500 voting threshold clearly places the letter before the 1772 legislation. Wesley's allegation that the stock had been split only days before the vote suggests that it also predates the 1767 reforms. Stock splitting first emerged on a large scale in 1763 and became commonplace in subsequent elections until declining under the pressure of tightening government controls, as shown by these data on the numbers of share transfers recorded by the company. So as you can see here, in the mid-1760s, there are great spikes in stock splitting and the transfer of shares before directors' elections, but gradually, as we get to 1770 and beyond, the practice declines and eventually seems to disappear. The letter seems to reflect detailed discussion with Blackwell, and this suggests that it was written in 1763, when unusually Wesley was in London, indeed staying with Blackwell, in late March and early April. Wesley's letter was intended to discourage stock splitting. His starting point was ethical, indeed theological. His fundamental charge was in claiming to own stock, which they had in effect merely borrowed. Stock splitters were breaking their oaths, and thus the third of the 10 commandments: "Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain." Wesley also presented stock splitting as an abuse of property rights and showed a profound understanding of how these worked in a commercial trading context. The temporary holders of split stock did not gain from any price rise while they held it, and this demonstrated that such sales were bogus. What was Wesley's objective in writing at this precise time? The April 1763 directors' election was highly contested, though the issues were as much those of personality as policy. The House list, mainly comprising incumbent directors under the former chairman Lawrence Sullivan, had worked with the government on the terms of the Peace of Paris, which ended the 7 Years' War and reduced, but did not eliminate, the French presence in India. The proprietors' list, led by Robert Clive and involving other former company officials, argued that these terms were too generous and were commercially damaging to the company. Both sides used stock splitting, but the proprietors' list more so. They gained 220 votes thereby, Sullivan and his allies only 160. Neither Wesley's nor Blackwell's stance on these issues are clear from the surviving papers. However, Blackwell was one of a small group of stockholders who organised a series of votes in April 1767, when the company was seeking to agree on, I quote, an equitable accommodation with the legislature respecting their late territorial acquisitions, end quote, in an unsuccessful attempt to stave off government intervention following its takeover of Bengal. In this context, Blackwell was working with the board and alongside prominent city figures such as Sir George Colebrook MP, who became chairman in 1769, and Sir James Cockburn MP. This faction wanted dividend payments to be affordable and sustainable, which would underpin stability in the share price and in the company's overall finances. Colebrook has been described as, I quote, conspicuous by his wealth and ostentation, and the ambitious and speculative nature of his financial activities, end quote. He acquired slave plantations in Antigua on his marriage in 1754, and later bought estates in Jamaica and elsewhere. Cockburn was also a wealthy slaveholder. These were awkward bedfellows for Blackwell, but arguably their ends were just: prudent management of the East India Company over the long term, with profits shared between stockholders and the public. Wesley's 1763 intervention was in the cause of seeking stability in the company's affairs. In the event, the speculators succeeded in driving up the East India Company's share price from the mid-1760s, although then it began a long period of fluctuating decline. So here you see the impact of the speculators driving up the share price, and then it begins its long path down. Its dividend history also charts a sorry tale. The company was run to maximize short-term returns from 1768 until, in the historian Bowen's words, I quote, the blind pursuit of a high market price for stock and a high level of dividend payment pushed the company to the very brink of financial collapse in 1772, end quote. To conclude, the East India Company, especially after its conquest of Bengal in 1765, epitomized colonial exploitation of the cruelest kind, but John Wesley was slow to condemn it. In part, this reflected the stark disconnect between activities and reputation of the company in Bengal and in Britain, which, for example, enabled company luminaries such as Robert Clive, Colebrook, and Cockburn to serve alongside Wesley's friend Ebenezer Blackwell as governors of St. Thomas's Hospital with apparently clear consciences. But there were further and distinctive features in Wesley's thinking. Early in his ministry, he had hopes that the company would support Methodist expansion in Asia as part of his self-proclaimed global mission. And through his close friendship with Blackwell, he long took the view that the company was not beyond redemption and supported Blackwell in his efforts to secure a top management team which was not focused exclusively on enriching stockholders over the short term. In 1776, recognizing that such private lobbying had proved ineffective, and in the context of continuing graphic reports and widespread condemnation of the company's excesses, Wesley finally spoke out. In the early 1780s, by which time Blackwell was dead, he engaged in repeated prophetic denunciation of the company. In doing so, he jeopardized any prospect of company support for a mission to India, and any lingering thought of that was abandoned. The East India Company presented Wesley with a prolonged and probably agonizing dilemma. His eventual public condemnation of the company was striking. The long silence which preceded it, even more so. Well, thank you for listening, and I'll say goodbye.